Let us pray. O God, through the written word and the spoken word, may we encounter the living word, even Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And a welcome to those who might be watching this through the internet and the website of the Springvale Uniting Church. The first half of Matthew chapter 2 is the standard text scheduled for Epiphany, which happens to fall next Friday. In passing, if anyone has the opportunity, head down to Frankston, to the Frankston Pier at midday. There you will see Greek Orthodox people in their yearly celebrations of Epiphany, of seeing many young men jumping off the pier to try and retrieve a wooden cross and thereby the bishop's blessing. I might be there, but given that I live in Frankston, that's not surprising. However, to more important things. It's important as we look at today's Gospel reading to remember what we've been told in the first half of the chapter. The whole chapter, chapter 2, is serious storytelling about real things. Way back in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, you will find a prophecy of a star and a sceptre arising out of the people of Israel. The star symbolises the priestly messenger, and the sceptre, the warrior, royal Messiah. There are other allusions. We not only have Israel going down into Egypt and being called out of Egypt in the Exodus as God's son, but we also have echoes of the attempt of the Pharaoh to kill Hebrew boys, which led to Moses being set among the bulrushes. Now, we all know about the romanticism of Christmas. Pretty scenes in the stable, with all sorts of nice, clean animals providing warmth on that winter's night. The nurses and midwives among you might blanch at the lack of sterility for the baby Jesus to be born in that place. One way to help people escape from this romanticism is to see what the story is saying in its distinctive way. History is repeating itself. Here is the true child of God, the true representative of Israel. Here is the Messiah, the Star of Israel. It's making very powerful statements about Jesus. It's showing the best of the world's wise, here the astrologers, magi, recognising Jesus and showing that the creation itself acclaims him by the code to be read in the sky. Also, the hope of Israel's prophet that the nations, even their kings, would come to Zion to acknowledge God, bearing gifts. This finds fulfilment. The story is celebrating the Gentile mission yet to come, and by contrast, reflecting on the rejection by the Jewish people who ought to have acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah. The pain of the latter is to be found in the title, King of the Jews. Herod will fail to find the child, but later rulers will not, and that title will stand as an accusation above the crucified Christ. So this narrative is stacked with many allusions. Now, these stories invite us to think creatively, but we need to do this by linking the story into the current day in the 21st century. To the sensitive imagination, the threatened ruler absurdly massacring helpless boys has allusions to events in our own day. Matthew is, after all, not just telling us about the baby and the past history of the adult Jesus, but also reflecting the pain which his own community has faced. That of understanding that Jews as a whole were rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. So, this pain belongs in the Christmas season if Christ is not to be trivialised. We have our stories of infants stolen from their families. Sometimes with the best of intentions, Aboriginal children were ripped from their mother's arms. The apology made on the floor of the Australian Parliament to the stolen generation was necessary and long overdue. This gospel story is one of rejection. but also one of inclusion, with a sense that to be in touch with this Jesus is to be truly in touch with the life and the rhythms which for the ancients were defined by the stars. We need to find our way of saying this in our language, in our imagery in 2017. It does not make a lot of sense to try and connect the event to real astronomy. Yes, a star arising in the east, what can we find that seems to make sense out of that? Attempts are still made, even now, to try and make that connection. The story invites participation, so that we too might kneel before the absurdity of a helpless child. Oh, come, let us adore him. We sang with gusto at the start of our service. But in worshipping the child, we must not just simply worship that child, but we must worship what the child became and what that child did in his life as a demonstration of God's love for the whole of this creation. So it's not just another typical piece of human adulation, which so often amounts to giving away one's dignity and surrendering one's accountability. So, the one who rushes to do obeisance can often be the first to oppress when the roles are reversed. Adoration is dangerous if the awe is at power and not at love. Notice how the passage ends with reference to Herod's son Archelaus. Escape from the tyrant Herod did not mean a happy ending. There is a refugee mentality here touched in the story, not just because Jesus actually went down to Egypt, but because the life of grace must dodge in between the powers. In our day, we see such vulnerability in the desperation of asylum seekers and their initiatives to escape oppression and to find a better life for their families. They're cast adrift on the ocean, vulnerable to apparently well-meaning politicians who are driven by other agendas and others who just want to make the fast dollar. Christians who call themselves Nazarene would also recognise their theme here, and for others the choice of Nazareth is the choice of strategic obscurity. There, so that he can't be found by Archelaus. So let's turn to today's world and the real questions which arise out of this passage. Right at its heart is the question of evil. Why did Jesus safely get to Egypt to later return, and the innocent boys got massacred instead? Is God in control or not? Now, we can only go so far back into the worldview of the biblical writers. In the end, we need to retell the stories in a way that also addresses our questions. We need to face issues that may not have bothered them, or were simply not seen to be issues of any relevance. Firstly, evil is real. Just think to the barrel bombs dropped on Aleppo by Assad and his regime. There are embodied forces of institutions and governments and armies and, yes, churches. These things are real, and they often array themselves against the purposes of God, therefore becoming even demonic. Secondly, I want to suggest to you that God's power is not as we've always imagined it. God's power is not the power to coerce. It is not hard power. Under the influence of Greek philosophy, we have traditionally affirmed that God was all-powerful. But this now raises more issues than it solves. If God is all-powerful, why did God not stop Auschwitz, for example? And you can think of 1,000 or 1,000,000 other ways of asking that question. And you can ask it, and you're not human if you have yet to get to your length of life on this planet without asking that question. No matter how good some imagined heaven may be in recompense for our suffering, no matter what Jesus does, The deaths at Bethlehem are not excused by it. It is unethical and evil of God to kill people for good ends. The ends do not justify the means. And I choose to make that statement. Whether you agree with it is up to you. It's very hard to say that God is not all-powerful. It requires us to completely rethink our theology. What if, to begin, we said God's power is different? God does not coerce us into submission. God loves us into partnership with God. Coercing the world into submission is what omnipotence comes down to. What if God invites and loves us into partnership, into a cooperation of love and blessing? What if that is the power that is at the basis of the whole universe? What if the biblical stories call us away from the old reality of brute force and the survival of the fittest? We can glimpse a new fitness for being human. Power is not domination to survive and rule. Power is giving, enabling, sacrificing. Power is building up the weak. This half-glimpsed contradiction and supposed heresy turns life on its head. It threatens everything we have and all that we are, and yet it graces us with moments of fulfilment, contentment, and sheer nobility beyond anything we have yet seen. In his book, The Weakness of God, Dr. Caputo rejects the God of strong power. He says, beyond the cross, there isn't a reservoir of awesome force. The power of God is just the weakness of the cross. The cross exhausts what we mean by the power of God with no remainder. End of quote. This means that Herod's attempt to maintain his power by killing the boys is, in fact, not an act of power at all. Yes, it is evil. It is a rebellion against God's way, but it is futility. It has completely misunderstood the basic structure of the creation. Hard power will fail, not so much because it's against God, as though it fights God on an equal footing. It will fail because it completely misunderstands the nature of the creation it seeks to dominate. Consider the events which gave rise to the birth of every one of us. There is so much random probability of exactly which egg in your mother and of which sperm from your father leads to the birth of you. I think you know enough of what we might call the practicalities of birth to know that the randomness in them is extraordinary. Think about it. Think about it. From that, we can often begin to think of the world as being indifferent, even alien. Perhaps we feel tiny and alone. The fact that a child is born, survives, loves and grows to be a compassionate, heroic, loving individual means that the greater proportion of the world is on God's side, already working in partnership to co-create a new heaven and a new earth. Even in Syria and Sudan, for example, but any other numbers of places fit as well, people love in the midst of massacre and death and destruction. In the concentration camps that Australia has created in Manus Island and in Nauru, people love, they protest against evil and they work for good. The most recent man who's died from whatever cause, we are really not quite sure, but he's part of a community in Manus Island, and his last words apparently were, "Look after my family," in the expectation that somehow those people that he formed a community with will in some strange way be able to do it. The petty power of our government and the pathetic Me Too attempt of the opposition to be just as hard is indeed a rebellion against God. But the greater part of creation knows that they're wrong and acts accordingly. There's a painting by a painter called Luke Merson called Flight into Egypt. It's extraordinarily powerful. Now, if I was clever, I could pick up a copy of it and would have included it in the PowerPoint display. But I'm not that clever with playing such things. But in the picture, Mary and the baby are seated, are cradled in the gigantic arms of a sphinx in Egypt. It's night. There is some unknown spotlight on Mary. Mary's asleep, content. The baby is in her arms, and all you can see is just the merest image of the chin of the sphinx and the arms of this great animal, because that's what it was in Egypt when you see that picture. So it leads me to say that the pretensions to power of governments such as Syria and even our own pale beside the imagined power of a sphinx. Yet this great power holds the child safe in its paws in a lonely and hostile place. As we Australians mourn the actions of our government which attacks the poorest members of our community to bolster its harshness, let's remember that the greater part of creation is on the side of God. So this is my word to you today. Serve Jesus. Follow Jesus as your way to God.